So again, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. And if there is anything that you liked on the table for snack-wise, please take it home. I just don't want it to go to waste. That's all. And you know, if you liked the clam and crab dip, that needs to be refrigerated. So whatever works for you. So I wanted to, let me introduce myself again. Linda Smith, enrolled at Tulalip on my mother's side. My mother is a Jones, Lillian Jones, and her parents were Carl and Cecilia Jones. And if you were Native, then you would know which branch of the tribe my family was part of, just by that. If you say Jones, I have to tell you, my maiden name was McIntosh, and my father's family is from Scotland. But when my brother Ralph decided to go fishing on tribal waters after the usual and custom fishing rights were received, he said, I'm going to have a birth by the Jones boys because nobody will bother me. Or my boat. So family is really important. And so that's who I am, and I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. And during the week since we've been apart, it has come to my attention that some of the video wasn't quite as clear as it. I don't know if it was because it was enlarged or what, but there were a couple of slides that went up that you did not get to read, and I wanted to be sure and speak a little about a couple of those slides. And then the other thing I wanted to ask is, did you have any questions about last week? Anything that I could clarify for you or point you to a direction of what might give you more information? Was it helpful?
One family for 18 years.
Yeah.
They were white.
Good.
My parents loved us, and I understand that, but at the same time,
They took the idea that they were saving me.
saving us from ourselves.
Being saved, and I should be grateful for the life that I've been given, because any child on the reservation would give anything to live as I was living.
They took us away from our mom. They came marching right in, and
Good, because you know that's why we started with the doctrine of discovery, and then tonight's is the boarding school as a result of things that happen on the doctrine of discovery, and then next week is the other portion of the missing and murdered Indigenous people, because that's some of the trauma from the boarding school. So that's how I want to put it together. Yes, Scott?
You mentioned your mom. Now, I may have this wrong, and it's a bit personal, but...
But you're going to ask anyway, okay.
Did you tell me your mom was a nurse, right?
Yes, she was. She
And
was an LPN at the Everett General Hospital.
So, you know, that's a generation back from you, and that goes back a ways.
Uh-huh.
Was that atypical, that
Yes, there were.
would get an education and go into medicine and that kind of thing?
Yes, that was very atypical.
Yeah.
And when we talk about generational trauma, maybe I will expand on that a little bit. But,
Okay.
and we'll have a slide on the generational trauma
Yeah.
as we move along.
Okay.
So the answer is
But I
yes.
thought that was interesting.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And she actually worked as an LPN for the Weyerhaeuser Timber Company in Everett.
Oh, wow.
She was their on-site nurse.
Very cool.
Yeah. Okay, anything else before we kind of go? Okay. Well, I thought this was a really interesting slide because this is all about westward expansion. And on there it talked about the manifest destiny, the belief that it was the destiny of the United States to acquire all Western territories. So you know where we started, right? There on the East Coast, and then we moved westward. Okay, next slide, Ken. And you can see where the original 13 colonies were, and then as the country grew by war and purchase, and you can just see how that moved westward. So, okay, Ken.
That was presented in the textbooks that we read as such
Yes. Oh, nothing mentioned like the next slide Ken's going to give us? Indian land for sale, perfect title. Possession within 30 days. You know, agricultural, dry farming, grazing. You can irrigate it. Oh, where did it come from? Okay, Ken, next slide. Well, and who of you haven't heard about Sitting Bull? So I just thought this was so interesting. What a title. Wanted for acts against the U.S. peace. Isn't that interesting? It's absolutely a total mind switch, isn't it, when you see it like that? I just thought that was so interesting as it pertains to the country growing west. Okay.
That's a lot of money in those days, too.
Yeah, it was. It was a fortune. Okay, this particular slide was in our video last week, and I didn't think it showed up very well. It says, here were hanged 38 Sioux Indians on December 26, 1862.
You know where here was?
Yes, it's in Minnesota. And in another life, I was the Native American coordinator for the Lutheran Church in America Synod prior to the merger. And in that life, I had some partners. There was in existence at that time the National Indian Lutheran Board, or the NILB, and its executive director was Eugene Crawford. And one of the things the NILB did was provide grants around the country, and they provided a grant at Skokomish for a roof for the smokehouse, and they provided a grant up at Tulalip for some help with another building. And so they did this all around the country, and the way they generated the funds was through a Native American Celebration Sunday, and the offerings went to the National Church, and then they were divvied out in grant form through the NILB. So at this workshop that my colleague from Oregon and I put together, we called it One in the Spirit, and it was for clergy and Synod Council. And what we provided was an experience where Native religious leaders would come and share with the non-Native folks. And this particular one was at Warm Springs. No, this one was at Warm Beach. We did a different one at Warm Springs. And Pastor Paul Lundborg, I don't know if any of you ever have known him. He was at Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd for a while. He moved out here from Minnesota. And Eugene Crawford were sitting at the table for breakfast. And Paul said to Eugene, I want to tell you about an experience that happened to my grandfather. And when he got done with the story, Eugene says, I want to tell you about an experience that happened to my grandfather. So this grandfather was murdered, and this grandfather was hung. And it was about land. It was about people being tired of being pushed, and treaties being broken, and things not being fulfilled. And a group of the natives said, enough. And so there were clashes, and then the result of that was they rounded up any of the natives that they thought had participated, and I think there was about 100, and then that they actually hung 38 of them. It is the largest mass hanging in America's history, but it's not in the history books. And those, no. So
It's amazing how you could have almost told that story and just replaced it with the words Hamas and Israel and Gaza.
yeah,
Some
Yeah.
of those same
yeah,
land,
land.
oppression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just to get this in history,
Yes.
1862 was the big Caribou gold rush that followed the California rush than the Caribou. And it just happens to be the same date.
History is so interesting, and sometimes we don't always hear all of it. So anyway, that's what was in the video. I wanted you to know that history, and I guess I should complete that a little bit. In our hymnal is a hymn that's called Many and Great, O God, Are Your Promises. And it is a Lakota tune, and there was a French Canadian who translated the words. And it is said that those who were hung sung that on their way to being hung. And I have difficulty when they choose that hymn. They choose it because it's one of the few native hymns, but they don't know necessarily the history of how the Lakota people used it. But it's good to know that on their way to the gallows, they were talking about God's promises, right? Isn't that wonderful? So that part, that's the good part of it. Okay, so that explains that picture. You may have seen it, but that explains it. And Paul wrote a book about it. I don't have it in my hand, but it's a little paperback book. He went and researched his family history. He lives in Olympia, just so you know. Okay, so this was the Indian land cessation, and it comes. You can see how the top one, it's all solid color, and then 1874 is the first one where they start moving back. In 1860, by the time the gold rush hit, the U.S. had broken the treaty agreements and made new laws to gain more land. Tribal nations had already been pushed west of the Mississippi, because you don't see any reservations back there. And after being promised that the West was reserved as their territory, according to treaties, the Mississippi was, whites on the east side and Indians got the west side. But guess what? They broke treaties again, right? Yeah, one after another. And then these are the last picture with those little tiny dots on it, which don't show up very well. I'm really sorry about that. They're, the size of reservations are pretty little. They're acres. They're not anything like they used to be. I mean, when you think about that last little picture and then what it was. So that's what that is. Okay, questions? All right, so then I have had interaction with the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. After this, we're going to call it NABS. And actually, two of Tulalip's wonderful women work for NABS in very, very good positions. And so they have an educational component, and it says you can download it. And so I did. And so what I'm using then is their curriculum. They have a primary curriculum and they have a high school curriculum. And so I've kind of meshed them because I like some parts of one and some parts of the other. And so this is where my information comes from. And this picture in front of you, which I'm pointing to the back, I'm sorry, is Carlisle Indian School. This is the first one, and I want you to notice how they're all lined up, similar clothing, just a number, just a number. So I want to read this. Let's go to the next slide, Ken. And you can't read this, I realize that. I could at home on my computer, but you can't. So it says, beginning with the Indian Civilization Act Fund of March 3rd, 1819, and the Peace Policy of 1869, the United States, in concert with and at the urging of several denominations of the Christian Church, adopted an Indian boarding school policy expressly intended to implement cultural genocide through the removal and reprogramming of American Indian and Alaska Native children to accomplish the systematic destruction of Native cultures and communities. The stated purpose of this policy was to kill the Indian and save the man. Between 1869 and the 1960s, hundreds of thousands of Native American children were removed from their homes and families and placed in boarding schools operated by the federal government and the churches. Though we don't know how many children were taken in total, by 1900 there were 20,000 children in Indian boarding schools. And by 1925, that number had more than tripled. What's 3 times 20? 60,000. The U.S. Native children that were voluntarily or forcibly removed from their homes, families, and communities during this time were taken to schools far away where they were punished for speaking their native language, banned from acting in any way that might be seen to represent traditional or cultural practices, stripped of traditional clothing, hair, and personal belongings, behavior reflective of their native culture. They suffered physical, sexual, cultural, and spiritual abuse and neglect, and experienced treatment that in many cases constituted torture for speaking their native languages. Many children never returned home, and their fates have yet to be accounted for by the U.S. government.
What was the goal? Like, if I was running a school, a successful outcome would be sending a kid back to the reservation, now civilized?
Yes.
Or, okay.
Civilized, speaking English, and shunning their own traditions, their own way of. Native people generally let their hair grow long. They cut their hair when they're in mourning. So when they cut off all their hair, that was immediately the boarding school administration's way of taking away their culture. That's the first thing.
So there had to have been kids that, I mean, with that amount of trauma and brainwashing, there had to be enough kids being sent back to the reservation, now trying to convert all the other savages, or you know what I mean? Like,
So,
I
yes.
imagine it worked to a degree. It was so.
It worked to a degree, but what also happened was that many never made it back to their reservations. They went out into society where they didn't really fit in either, because they were still discriminated against. Still, they had no place to live. They had no identity anymore. They were just lost. And yet there were still some who went home, and some who went home were kind of wild in their behavior. They were out of control because they didn't fit.
Yeah.
They had no place back on the reservation. They didn't fit, and they were shunned, probably one would say, because they weren't like what was there. And they had no connection to their parents because that had been severed. And I don't know if you've ever had anyone that's been institutionalized, but when you've been institutionalized, what does it take, 60 days until you just become rote? You're told what to do, when to do, how to do it. I'm going to segue just a little bit. I was at a hearing that the Interior Secretary, Deb Haaland, had up at Tulalip. And one of the survivors got up and said, "Thank God the bell's been silenced, because the bell ran their life. When to get up, when to eat, when to go to prayer, everything was done by the bell." And her comment was, "Thank God the bell's been silenced." Interesting. Because that was what ran her life. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, I just want to step back here a little bit, and you can see the picture of that general, and it says, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." General Richard Henry Pratt. And that was the mentality of the military then. Okay, Ken, let's go to the next one. So, You can see the handcuffs. These were handcuffs that were used at Haskell Indian Institute for children. They would be handcuffed to their beds, for one thing. So it's superimposed on another picture, but below that is a picture of a group of Native American children also at Haskell in Lawrence, Kansas. And again, they're all in, yeah, little, you know, would you mistake them for native kids? No. Okay, Ken, let's go. Next one. This is the picture that's behind the handcuff picture. These are Sioux boys that were sent to school, and there's the before picture and how they arrived at school. 3 years later, there they are. And you can just look at the picture and say, how could they possibly relate back on the reservation? Who's going to be accepting of that? It was just institutionalizing is all I can think of to say. And you know the stories of how many of them would in secret try to speak their language, and you know how they were punished. You know, it's absolutely horrendous what was done to those children. And if they ran away, they got beaten when they would go back and find them. And it's terrible. I have difficulty finding a good story about going to a boarding school or being institutionalized. So let's go to the next. Do you have any questions before I move on? Do you have any questions? This is all kind of heavy stuff, I know.
What year are we talking generally?
Oh, let's see, Carlisle, let me just see. 1879, the first boarding school opened. 1879. Yeah. Nope. So let me just give you a little time frame, and maybe this will help, okay? We know that in 1492, Columbus did what? Yes, but he didn't get to America, thankfully. And you know where he landed. Those people were all annihilated. He was not a nice man. I have no idea why we have a national holiday named after him. If you looked into his history, you would say, what are we thinking? Then in 1646, John Eliot preaches his first sermon to an Indian audience, laying the foundation for a missionary program in New England that sought to civilize Indians by isolating them and praying towns. So he wanted to civilize them in towns that were Christian, okay? And that was in 1646. And the 1819 was the Indian Civilization Act. It authorized up to $10,000 a year to support the efforts of religious groups and interested individuals willing to live among and teach Indians. Civilizing meant stripping traditions and customs from native peoples and transforming them into Christian farmers or laborers. Then in 1824, the U.S. created the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In 1887, there was the General Allotment Act, and that divided the lands and allots tribal lands to individuals. I mean, when you were a member of the tribe, you didn't own anything. But the Allotment Act changed that, and you received an allotment, a piece of land. So that was another way of taking away how Native people lived, okay? So that's huge. And then 1902, the Dead Indian Act, non-Indians can now own Indian trust lands. In 24, the Indian Citizenship Act. So in 1924, Native people became citizens. They weren't considered citizens prior to 1924. How long ago was that? Only 99 years, right? So just a little before Don was born. And so, that's kind of like how this, and there's many, many more laws that enter into that. So from 29 to present, the Indian Reorganization Act, in 72, the survival schools, the American Indian Movement. Any of you remember that when they wanted to take back in the Black Hills of South Dakota? Do you remember that? Yes, I think there's still one in prison for what happened at Wounded Knee. And 21, No Child Left Behind. In 1990, the Language Revitalization Act. And 06, Native American Language Preservation Act. So there's continually more and more laws around Native folks. Just they're the most governed of any of the races. And if you want to know more, I'll be happy to share that with you. So let's go to the next slide, Ken. And this is kind of a connection. And when we say boarding schools, we kind of use that generically, but there were many different kinds of schools. So I'm going to help you read this. In 1900, there were 20,000 children in boarding schools. In 25, there was 60,889. There were 150 residential schools in Canada with 150,000, 6,000 of whom went missing. No accounting for what 6,000 of the 150,000 in Canada went missing, which means they either died and were buried in an unknown grave, or they walked off. But they didn't let them walk off. They usually went and found them. They found 266, if I'm correct, about a year ago up in Canada, which started this whole movement about how many other grave sites are there here in America that we don't know a thing about. So, and that original act of finding those graves, our ELCA, Native American group, sent out a request that congregations in memory create a banner and put it up for 266 days in memory of those who have died at boarding schools, and encouraged every congregation to do that. And then, so the removal of the children encompassed mission schools and many different denominations. There were boarding schools. There were Indian schools that were run by the tribes. There were day schools where they only had to go through the day. There were military schools, fort schools, labor schools and camps, sanatoriums, because they got TB. You remember how bad TB was back then? Some were adopted. You remember we went through a period where they really made it sound wonderful to save a Native American child, and that these were neglected children, but what they were doing was removing children again and adopting them into non-Native families. And that's why you have the Indian Child Welfare Act to put a stop to that. And there were orphanages, and there were detention or reform schools. So there were a variety of schools where the children were.
Which then, that would make the church complicit, because then you've got well-meaning, good-hearted Christian folks wanting to help, thinking they're doing the Lord's work.
Yes, but how they worked wasn't necessarily very Christian in terms of, in terms of the sexual abuse, the beatings, the mental abuse. I don't find that Christian at all. There were pedophiles,
The adoptions that took place.
Yes, which were later, just ahead of the Indian Child Welfare Act. There was a time when they would advertise for placements for Native children. They, meaning the government, kind of marketed them how wonderful it would be to save this child who didn't live in a good home and didn't have good parents or whatever, and so they would get
a white Christian family wanting to do good.
Yes, and there were just white families wanting to do good, so they weren't always Christian. So yes, that happened too.
Yeah.
And And that was the thrust, as I said, about the Indian Child Welfare Act, where the placement goes to Native first, and then they really search for relatives who will take children before they get adopted out or placed out in non-Native homes.
And at this point, now today, you can't adopt an Indian child, can you? I think that the tribe won't let you somehow.
Um,
Oh, I know what you're talking about. They're basically. Yeah, that was a while ago. They did have something like,
it's
it was very difficult to adopt a Native American
mhm.
child.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
it had to go through the tribal council and things like this.
Native American children up for adoption are federal wards. You don't just do it the ordinary way.
It-
They are
well,
outside the tribes, or within the tribes, as I understand it, and as part of my family history, is they become federal wards. If they are in the schools or the orphanages or anything like that, they have to have a federal representative before a judge before anything is done in their lives, up to age 21, and that was as of 1945.
at Tulalip, where I'm enrolled. Oh, the tribal court, will seek a relative for placement. And however they have to do that, it will go to a relative first, a tribal person next, and down that in order to maintain that cultural connection. And they go to great lengths to maintain that connection with the tribe.
Before they adopt.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to get them. Very rarely are you ever going to get it beyond the tribe. Gwen, did you have a comment? Did I answer it?
I was told by the people at the Chehalis tribe that the children, members of the Chehalis tribe, belong to the tribe. They don't belong to the family as much as they belong to the tribe, and the tribe looks after them.
Yeah, and if you didn't hear that, the Chehalis tribe said that they are the guardians of the child. And they will have say in whatever happens to the child. Does that make sense? Okay, those are really kind of like tough things, right? So then I want you to know that there are national archives where records are located. Oops, let's see, can you go back one, Ken, please? Down there at the bottom, it indicates where natives can go to look for history, records, information. And those are national archives all around the country. But not everything's stored there. Sometimes church kept records, sometimes historical societies, sometimes universities. I know that down at Willamette, they have some of the information for Chemawa Indian School there in Salem. And there's museums, the state and tribes and public libraries, all of that information. Some of the information can be in any of those places.
Again, just to put this in perspective, Centralia started in 1851. So all these dates that you're giving is way after that.
Mm-hmm. Well, just think about it. We weren't given citizenship till 1924. There's a lot of history there. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And these are the states alphabetically that had schools. And Alabama had 1. Arizona had 51. Why do you think that is? Oh, wait, they moved all the Indians out of the West Coast, out of the East Coast, right? That could be part of it. And that had the schools. Okay, and so this is alphabetically. Oklahoma had 83 schools. New Mexico, 26. New York, the ones that sold Long Island, 3. because there weren't any left, right? Kept moving them west. So you're going to wonder, how many did Washington State have, right? So far, they have identified 13 sites. Colville, Cushman in Tacoma, Fort Spokane, Puyallup. There's some on the Yakima side, Tonasket, Tulalip, Yakima. Those are all the areas that had school. There's some other names to that, but like at Tulalip, it was a Catholic site, and gee, they named the land after Priest Point. It's kind of interesting how that happened.
Alaska, do you have any?
Oh, I don't, do I have Alaska in here? My friend, Alaska had 33, and those up around the Nome area got sent to Wrangell, and there was a huge school there at Wrangell, and her mother was sent there, and it was populated by pedophiles, and they had a lot of sexual situations there at the Wrangell School. And there, I have all of the schools listed, and if you wanted to know one of them, I could do that for you.
The school is still operating in Sitka.
There still is?
Yes, I went to school with a lot of the kids.
Ah, yeah. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, I just kind of told you what these were. Okay, go to the next one. But basically, you see that the schools are all west and very few of them on the east coast. Okay, so I want to talk about what happens with generational trauma, right? Because the first generation were post-Civil War through World War I. That's the group that we're talking about. It was the end of the Indian Wars. There were military-style schools, uniforms, haircuts, forced assimilation, prohibition of native language and cultures. That's the first group, right? The second generation was the Great Depression era through World War II, and students could be bilingual. And sometimes boarding school became an escape or a route from poverty, because they had put these tribes, I don't know if you know where most of them are, it's where there's no employment, nothing. There's no resources for them. And then in 24, they got the right to vote, and they actually, natives enlisted in World War II due to military influence of first generation boarding school. And who do you know from World War II? The code talkers. Do you remember that? Yeah, that's where they came from. And then the third generation, the post-war era through the civil rights era, boarding schools scaled back in favor of public schools. Students confront racism and discrimination for their mixed heritage. Boarding schools begin to include vocational training. You'll see a lot of pictures where the females are at sewing machines and the boys are out farming. And then they began to turn the boarding schools over to tribal nations through the BIA. And the fourth generation is the post-civil rights era to the present. Some 73 schools that began under the original housing era included Sherman, Haskell, Santa Fe, and those are still in operation, but they've been turned over to natives. It's not under non-native. And then native language has been, and culture has now being promoted through tribes and through other things. And yet we still have generation to generation trauma. It's there. So next slide, please, Ken. Next slide, please. Next slide. When we talk about cultures, right? And those were many of the cultures that were present that got sent to these schools where they got stripped of everything they knew, right? Including their language. And so I just want you to think about how these kids went to boarding schools and life was different. You went in this door and you came out a different person, right? And so you've been traumatized because of your losses. So next slide, please. This is, if we carry intergenerational trauma, and we do, then we also carry intergenerational wisdom. It is in our genes. And so, intergenerational trauma was kind of a new term in these last few years because we didn't talk about it. How could that be? You just, get on with it. Just buck up, Isn't that what we tell people? But sometimes what people have been through takes a while, and what has been done to them, they do to someone else, right? You've seen that in abuse cases because they don't know anything else. You've seen it with parenting because if you haven't had any parenting, how do you parent the next generation? And if that generation hasn't had parenting, how do you parent? So you see generation to generation to generation, and it just is something that has to continually be worked on. But it is the intergenerational wisdom, the grandmothers, who help much of the healing that goes on. And so when they're having to confront this trauma, they have to, because if you don't face it and name it, you know what happens when you sweep it under the rug, right? It's going to fester and something's going to not work. So if you can get an understanding of the trauma, why it happened, how it happened, then you can kind of have a better picture. And you can let go of the pain. It's not easy. It doesn't like overnight. It doesn't happen that fast. It takes some people a lot longer than others. And then you have to be able to move beyond the trauma. Right? So for many natives, next slide please, they use the medicine wheel. Next slide please. And that's 1/4 of it is spiritual, attending a ceremony, church, or other spiritual gathering. Mental is spend time alone for mindful reflection, and there's other things. Emotional, you know how helpful journaling is? Journaling, It's very, very helpful. And physical, do some exercise, get some endorphins out there, eat healthy. That's one of the issues often is if poor people tend to, I believe, have diabetes more often than not. And if you don't have good nutrition, if you don't have money for good nutrition, how are you supposed to eat healthy? Have I whizzed by anything too fast?
You're doing a good job.
Thank you.
It made me think about in Ukraine, the Russians are kidnapping children
Yes.
and taking them to kind of re-education camps. And
Yes.
the whole idea is it's to kill the culture.
Yes.
It's to kill the Ukrainian culture
Yes.
and make them Russian.
Absolutely.
The Babylonian captivity of Israel was to take all these people as hostages and teach them how to be good Babylonians. And so this is a well-worn strategy.
It is.
Of destroying it's a form of genocide, not murdering people, but their culture.
Yes. And they murdered people too.
Well, that's right. But the kill the Indian, save the. It was how do we destroy a culture?
Yeah. And when we say it like that, Peter, I think about all those Europeans. They had all that history. And what did they do? Brought it over here and said, "Oh, well, it worked over there. Let's try it here."
Yeah.
Right?
Isn't it Stalin who said, give me your children and I'll change your, I'll be able to take over everything because I've got your children.
Give me one generation.
Yeah,
with your kids.
yeah.
One generation, yeah.
The Germans did it with the Jews.
Yeah.
The Germans, yeah.
I went to school where they were doing that.
Yeah. So it's not new. It's not new, and it's not pretty. But if we don't know anything, what do we do? So then the question I have is, the question that they ask is, why do you think this history isn't taught in our schools, because I'm pretty sure that none of you learned any of this in your schools. I'm thankful that the state of Washington now has mandated curriculum time immemorial, so that it is now being taught here, Native history is now being taught here in the state of Washington. And so, you know, finally, because the history that is taught is always cleaned up, right? Always cleaned up.
It's similar to just like in curriculum, how they've left out Black people and their accomplishments and how they're a part of history, and as well as just women in general.
Right, in general,
Well, I'm sorry.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mean that, but I mean, you know, there are women and also Black people and other races have
Yeah.
such an important part of history, but it isn't like
Yeah.
part of the curriculum.
Yeah.
It's getting there.
So I just wanted to share with you a little bit about that hearing that I attended up at Tulalip when Secretary Deb Haaland was out, Secretary of the Interior. And she held, I think it's 7 or 9 hearings around the country with survivors of boarding school. And they came and to tell their stories. And it's not easy to acknowledge publicly what's been done to you. And in particular, Jewel James, he's a Lummi, he's a marvelous master carver, and he often carves totems for different reasons. The last one, I believe, is for the removal of Snake River dams, and sent a totem that way, and they would stop along different ways so people can see it and have a ceremony. But Joel came, and he brought 3 things. He brought a cincture. Do you know what a cincture is? What's a cincture, Peter?
It's the little rope I tie around my waist if I wear my robe.
And who wears robes? Nuns and priests, right? And pastors. And he brought a 2-inch leather belt. And the 3rd thing he brought was, remember a long time ago, Don, when they used to sharpen their razor blade on the leather? And he said, the cincture is so I'll never forget who did this to me. The leather belt is what they used on me, as is the other piece of leather. And you know, to be able to speak to people who've suffered time and time again. And it goes on. So let's have the last slide. So I'm sure the question you have is, well, I hope it is, what can we do? Right? Well, of course, the first thing you can do is pray. And I think that it is such a powerful thing to be able to do. And you can advocate for justice, supporting legislature that's out there. And right now, there is a piece of legislature that's stuck in Congress that would create a commission that would require the U.S. to tell Native people what happened to their children. And so I'll make copies of that and have them out on Sunday. And then you can learn more. This is like a little hour, and I want to tell you so much, and I'm like, oh, I'm going too fast, and oh, there's more, and so learn more. Out on the table, I brought some books that the NABS, Native American Boarding School Coalition, recommended for reading. You might want to take a look at those. And then the thing that I think is most important that we can do is to love our neighbor and not judge them. Get to know them. Find a way to participate with them in some of their things that are open to the public. And to be thankful for the opportunities. And you know, we live in a really, really Native American community area here that is just full of history. And I have a friend who continues to send me Native articles. I have a lot of articles. This is the she's a boarding school survivor, and she was telling her story. And I have any number of articles like that. So anyway, I thank you very much.
I know there was a video you wanted to watch. We have a church Facebook group that I think it would be easy to put that video up on our Facebook
Oh, good.
site.
That would be wonderful.
That would be, and it's a survivor story, and it's really, really helpful. So, any questions? Well, it's a lot to take in, and I'm available for questions and one-on-one conversation or a cup of coffee, whatever you would like. I would be more than willing to do that. And just a heads up, next week we're doing the murdered and missing Indigenous people. And I didn't check the State Patrol site today, but the last time, about 3 weeks ago, we had 133 here in the state of Washington that are missing, okay? And that number fluctuates on almost a daily basis. Anything else? Well, I'm going to do what I did last week. Let us pray. Eternal Spirit, life maker, pain bearer, life giver, source of all that is and that shall be, Father and Mother of us all, loving God in whom is heaven, the hallowing of your name echo through the universe, the way of your justice be followed by the peoples of the world. Your heavenly will be done by all created beings. Your commonwealth of peace and freedom sustain our hope and come on earth. With the bread we need for today, feed us. In the hurts we absorb from one another, forgive us. In times of temptation and test, strengthen us. From trial too great to endure, spare us. From the grip of all that is evil, free us. For you reign in the glory of the power that is love, now and forever. Amen. And thank you again, each and every one of you. And please, if there's any food left on the table, take it.
I already put some in my pockets, but I'll try to take some.
Oh, good, good. I appreciate that very much.